Story 1. I used to work as a driver for a freight company that handled awkwardly sized items no other couriers would take. We delivered everything from coffins to tractor parts and also collected items from customers for delivery the next day. The company employed a mix of contractors and permanent drivers. I was a relief driver, covering various routes when others were on holiday or out sick. The depot was managed by two people, a delivery manager and a collection manager. These two managers didn't get along very well since their goals often conflicted. The delivery manager prioritized getting items delivered, while the collection manager focused on picking up goods for the next day. Any failure to meet their targets caused a lot of tension between them. One day, I was assigned to cover a contractor's route. Since I was unfamiliar with it, loading my truck took longer than usual. I ended up with 45 deliveries, which was a high volume for this predominantly rural area. I asked the delivery manager if he could help me map out the route. He assured me that he could and planned the route for me. Although I was a bit behind schedule, I set out. Before leaving, I mentioned to him that I might struggle to complete everything on time and asked him to keep an eye on my progress. He agreed. By midday, I realized it was impossible to finish all the deliveries and collections. One particular collection was located well off the route, and I noticed the contractor had a vehicle nearby. It seemed logical for the contractor to handle that collection. I called the delivery manager, explained the situation, and gave him a choice. Either I prioritize deliveries or collections. I also suggested that the contractor take care of the off-route collection. His response was to call back later so he could sort something out. However, he insisted that the off-route collection still needed to be completed. When I called back later, he informed me there was no help available. Again, I asked whether I should prioritize deliveries or collections. He refused to choose and told me I had to do both. Shortly after, he went home for the day, leaving me to figure things out on my own. With no options left, I called the collection manager. She reiterated that no assistance was available. She told me I had to either fail the deliveries or the collections. Either way, I'd likely face consequences the following day. So, I decided to follow instructions exactly as given. This led to a bit of malicious compliance. I stopped at one of the collections and asked what time they closed. They said 6:30 p.m., so I assured them I'd be back later. I continued with the deliveries, even though it took me further away from that collection point. At the appropriate time, I stopped delivering and drove back to pick up the two small parcels for the collection. This detour cost me an hour. Afterward, I resumed delivering where I had left off. I finished my last delivery at 7:15 p.m., about 45 minutes from the depot. While driving back, I got a frantic call from the collection manager, asking where I was. I explained the situation and reminded her that I had asked for help 4 times during the day, but was told to do everything myself. The real trouble began when I finally returned to the depot just after 8 p.m. The company's trunking system relied on trucks leaving the depot by 7:30 p.m. My late arrival caused 15 frustrated employees to work overtime while waiting for my truck. An articulated vehicle was also delayed, as it needed the 2 parcels I collected. The delay disrupted the entire trunking system, causing a ripple effect that impacted deliveries the next day. When I returned, my routing came under scrutiny, as it was deemed questionable at best. I informed the collection manager that the delivery manager had organized the route. This led to a flurry of angry emails between the two managers. I imagine the logistics team also demanded explanations, and plenty of accountability was handed out. The next day, no one said a word to me about the incident. I wasn't assigned to that route again. For a while after that, they either provided help when I requested it or reduced my workload. Additionally, since I had exceeded the legal driving hours, they were required to let me leave early for a few days, a small victory in my book. The main issue with the company's management was their assumption that drivers were always looking for an easy day. Even when presented with clear evidence of the workload challenges, they were quick to dismiss concerns. This time, their lack of support backfired in a big way. Story 2. I was recently reminded of a situation from my childhood involving a teacher and a bit of what you might call malicious compliance. For context, I have a severe peanut and tree nut allergy. If I eat or even touch peanuts or nuts, I can go into anaphylactic shock. This means my throat could close up and I could suffocate. Because of this, I always carry an emergency epinephrine injection device with me. Now, let me provide a little background on this teacher. She was the type who clearly disliked children, a real tyrant in the classroom. She would yell at kids for making mistakes, no matter how minor. To keep things anonymous, I'll refer to her as Mrs. Idiot and myself as me. With that out of the way, let's get into the story. I was in the first grade, and by that time, I had a solid understanding of how dangerous my allergy was. I had learned to always read labels, avoid eating food prepared in other people's homes, and never trust someone who said, "I don't think it has nuts in it." If you're not sure, don't offer potentially harmful foods to small children who might not know any better. One day, I was sitting in class, happily coloring while waiting for my teacher to arrive. She eventually came in with a fun activity that involved candy. If I remember correctly, it was some sort of math exercise that used candies as counters. As she handed out worksheets and small packets of candy, I noticed that the candies were chocolate-coated ones that I was allergic to. The conversation that followed went something like this. Me. Mrs. Idiot, I can't have these. I'm allergic. Mrs. Idiot, these are the original ones. They don't have peanuts in them. Me. But my mom says I'm allergic to the originals too. Mrs. Idiot, they're fine. You can have them. To this day, I cannot understand why a teacher would tell a child with a known allergy to eat something they know or suspect could harm them. For reference, while the original candies don't contain peanuts, they are made on shared equipment with peanut products, which makes them unsafe for me. This back and forth continued for a while. Mrs. Idiot kept insisting the candies were safe, while I repeatedly explained they were not. I suspect she thought I was being difficult on purpose. Finally, she said, "Mrs. Idiot, if you don't start behaving, I'm going to call your mother, and you'll be in big trouble." At that moment, younger me had a realization. My mom would back me up entirely. Instead of trying to reason with her further, I smiled sweetly and said, "Okay, call her." I remember wondering why Mrs. Idiot refused to believe me. Looking back, it's clear she hated being corrected, especially by a first grader. Mrs. Idiot looked annoyed, but confident, probably assuming my mom would scold me for refusing to follow instructions. Little did she know, my mom was fiercely protective when it came to my allergy. I don't know the exact details of the phone conversation between my mom and Mrs. Idiot. This happened so long ago, and my mom doesn't remember the specifics. However, I do remember hearing my mom's angry voice through the phone from across the classroom. For the first time, I saw Mrs. Idiot look genuinely nervous. After what felt like an eternity of my mom yelling, Mrs. Idiot pulled me aside and handed me a bag of fruit-flavored candy, which she had apparently had the entire time. I was a little disappointed to sit alone while the rest of the class did the activity with their chocolates, but I happily ate my safe candy while completing the assignment. I knew full well that Mrs. Idiot was stewing at her desk, frustrated that a 7-year-old had outsmarted her. Later, I found out that my mom had sent an email to the school principal about the incident. Thankfully for Mrs. Idiot, my mom toned down her initial draft to be nicer. As a result, the teacher had to take a refresher course on food allergies, which she had already been shown at the start of the year. Despite this, the school kept her on staff, likely due to a shortage of teachers, even though she had other similar incidents with students. As much as I'd love to say I ate the chocolates and watched her career crumble like a badly built sandcastle, I didn't. After all, as the wise Sid the Sloth once said, "No thanks, I choose life." Story 3. I recently discovered that my mother has been secretly taking money, usually Christmas and birthday gifts, meant for my children and my siblings' children, her own grandchildren. The truth came out on Christmas Day when we celebrated at my sister's house. After we left, my mom sent a message in the family group chat, asking if anyone had seen the envelopes she had hidden in her room. These envelopes contained cash gifts from various family members for my nieces, who are 8 and 13 years old. When I got home, I decided to check through my own kids' gifts, just in case someone had accidentally picked up something in all the excitement and chaos. To my shock, I realized that money was missing from my daughter's envelope as well. I had been keeping it safely in my purse during the celebration. I mentioned this to my sister, telling her that money given to my daughter as a gift had also gone missing. She said she would let me know if anyone brought up anything similar. The next day, she told me that our mother had confessed to taking the money. Altogether, nearly $300 had been stolen from her 3 granddaughters. When confronted, my mom claimed she needed the money for medical reasons. However, we live in a country where healthcare is provided for free, so that excuse didn't hold up. Then she said something about how she spent the best years of her life raising us, and now has nothing to show for it because we all moved away. I honestly couldn't wrap my head around that reasoning. What made it worse is that she continued to speak to us as though she had done nothing wrong, and she hasn't returned the money despite repeated requests. Story 4. I've been saving up for almost a year, working part-time at my uncle's hardware store every weekend. Mountain biking has always been my passion, and I finally had enough to buy my dream bike, a high-end mountain bike that cost me nearly every penny I'd saved. My brother and I have been riding together since we were kids, so naturally, he was just as excited as I was about testing out the new bike. We decided to head to our local park, which is perfect for riding since there aren't any restrictions on bikes or skateboards. It's this nice oval-shaped area with a flat tarmac path around the edge and a grassy center with trees. The weather was perfect that day, and I was being extra careful with my new bike, constantly scanning my surroundings to avoid any accidents. My brother and I were taking turns testing the bike's handling. We were going at a decent speed, but nothing dangerous, just fast enough to get a feel for how it performed. There were the usual park visitors around, including this woman sitting on a bench, completely absorbed in her phone conversation. I called out to my brother that I was going to test the suspension on a small bump ahead. He shouted back telling me to go for it, but warned me jokingly not to scratch the bike on its first day. That's when everything went sideways. Just as I was approaching the bump, this little girl literally fell out of the tree right in front of me. I had to make a split-second decision and pulled up both wheels to hop over her. It was like time slowed down for a moment. Then crash. Another cyclist, who had no chance to react to my sudden maneuver, collided with me as I landed awkwardly. We both went down hard, and I felt this sharp pain shoot through my wrist as I hit the ground. After checking that I was mostly okay, I looked over at the other cyclist, who seemed shaken but unharmed. Our bikes, though, that was a different story. Both were seriously damaged. Then I heard crying and remembered the little girl, so I rushed back to check on her. She was pointing at the woman on the bench, her mother, while crying. I carefully helped her up and carried her over to her mother, thinking any parent would be worried sick about their child falling from a tree. Boy, was I wrong. The mother immediately started screaming at me, demanding to know what I had done to her baby and yelling at me for touching her daughter. When I tried to explain that her daughter had fallen from the tree while she was on the phone, she called me a liar and accused me of deliberately running into her child with my bike. She ranted about how kids like us were always causing trouble. My brother tried to defend me, explaining that we had witnessed her daughter fall, but she just screamed at him to shut up and announced she was calling the police. She threatened that we would pay for hurting her daughter. When the police arrived, she put on quite a show. She dramatically told the officers that we were delinquents who had deliberately run over her precious angel with our bikes. When the officer asked us if this was true, I tried to explain about her daughter falling from the tree and my attempt to avoid hitting her. But she kept interrupting, dismissing us as stupid kids causing trouble. The police seemed more inclined to believe her, probably because we were teenagers. But then this man who'd been walking his dog stepped forward and informed the officers about the security cameras all around the park, saying they would show exactly what happened. The look on her face when she heard that. Meanwhile, her daughter's leg was clearly injured, so someone had called an ambulance. The camera footage showed everything, her completely ignoring her daughter as she climbed the tree, the fall, my attempt to avoid hitting her, and the subsequent crash. The officers' attitudes changed pretty quickly after seeing that. It turned out the little girl had a broken leg. My wrist was fractured, and both bikes were completely wrecked. The best part? Not only did she have to pay for all the damages, but Child Protective Services got involved after seeing the footage of her negligence. The final tally: 2 destroyed bikes, including my brand new one, my fractured wrist, her daughter's broken leg, and her losing custody of her child. She also had to pay for all damages and medical bills, which I heard nearly bankrupted her. The silver lining was that the other cyclist's insurance helped cover some of the costs, and I got an even better bike as a replacement through her payment. Her daughter went to live with her father, who turned out to be a much more attentive parent. I still see her daughter at the park sometimes, with her dad now, actually paying attention to her instead of a phone. She's learned to ride a bike too safely, with proper supervision this time. Story 5. Okay friends, buckle up because this is a long one. Recently I read a story where a Redditor wanted to know if she was in the wrong because after finding a dog, and even after the rightful guardian of that very loved and missed dog contacted her, refused to give it back because she was now attached. This absolutely made my blood boil and made me want to scream in fury, because something similar happened to us years ago, and it still sticks in my craw, especially when I read how that Redditor was so incredibly selfish, thinking only of herself and caring nothing for what other people were going through. Here's the story. Many years ago now, I gave my mother a Chihuahua puppy for Mother's Day after her 18-year-old Akita passed away. This little dog, who I only spent $400 on, this is relevant later, let's call him Mickey, was my mother's baby, and they did everything together. When he was about 3 years old, while my mom was at work, a workman accidentally let him run out the door, and he disappeared. We searched for months for him. I spent several $100s for a pet finder. We put up posters at all the vets and ads in the paper. Basically, we did everything we possibly could to find him, but with no luck. 7 months after he went missing, I went to pick up my 2 dogs from a groomer doggy daycare, and as I was writing the check to pay them, my son and his friend were watching the dogs in the play area, when I heard my son exclaim, "Mama, there's Grandma Susie's dog." Mickey had a very unique marking on his back that looked like a silhouette of a Mickey Mouse head, so I absolutely knew it was him, and when I said his name, he ran to the gate and jumped up trying to get to me. I got so excited because I thought my mom's long nightmare was over, and through happy tears told the owner he was my mother's dog who had gone missing, and I was so happy to find him because Mom was grieving herself to death. She even slept with his bedtime toy that he loved so much. Well, imagine my heartache, anger and frustration when one of the groomers, let's call her Skank, said it was her dog. Then the owner of the place and Skank proceeded to scream at me and tell me I was wrong, but if it actually was my mother's dog, that we should just be glad that he wasn't dead, and Skank said she would not give him back. They were so nasty to me, they literally forced me out of the shop and threatened to call the police if I didn't leave. I was heartbroken, frustrated, but more importantly, I was determined to get my mother's fur baby back no matter what I had to do. After I told Mom I'd seen him, she raced over to the shop, but they had removed Mickey from the daycare area and wouldn't allow her to see him. They later called the police on her, even though she'd only asked to see him, not take him. After this, I was a woman on a righteous mission, so this is the beginning of my revenge. Skank wouldn't give me her name, so I hired a private detective to find out who she was, and once I got her name and address, I hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit. Now keep in mind, my mother didn't see him that day, so she went from being afraid to hope it was him, to knowing her baby was alive, but with someone else, and it all was driving her to distraction. Grief was overwhelming her every day, to the point where she couldn't work, and she cried constantly, so I was sincerely worried for my mother's health. Deciding I wanted to try to drum up some support for our situation, and to encourage my mother to fight. We even went to the local press, and they did a story about us in the paper. It can probably still be found on the web if you had our real names. At any rate, it took a few months, but we finally got our first court date. Skank showed up, but without the dog, and because of this, our case was the talk of the courthouse, because the judge actually had to subpoena the dog to get Skank to bring him. A few days later, I was sitting next to my mother in the courtroom when Skank walked in holding Mickey. Now keep in mind, until that moment, my mother hadn't laid eyes on him for nearly a year, and no matter how much I insisted it was definitely Mickey I saw, until that moment, she was too afraid to hope it was. When she saw him, she grabbed my hand and gasped his name. It was almost like she had been jolted with electricity, and her heart started to beat truly for the first time since Mickey went missing. This just made me more determined to do whatever I had to do to get him back. When our case was called, we provided a ton of evidence that Mickey belonged to us, including his registration papers, vet records, and photos. When my mother took the stand, she quietly but forcefully spoke of how deeply she loved him, how much he enriched her life and gave her purpose, and how she understood why Skank wouldn't want to give him back, because he was such a loving dog. But she explained he was that way because she, my mom, had poured her heart and soul into loving him. When it was Skank's turn, she took the stand holding the dog and had put a t-shirt on him to try and hide the Mickey Mouse silhouette marking on his back. Well, the judge wasn't stupid, and when he asked to hold Mickey, he simply lifted up the shirt to reveal the marking that was clearly shown in the 50-plus photos we had brought with us. She had none. After Skank talked a bit about how she'd grown attached to Mickey, the judge sent her back to her seat and addressed the courtroom. My mom and I held our breath, truly afraid of what he might say, and he started by saying he understood this was a difficult situation and it was obvious both parties loved the dog. Mom had a death grip on my hand at this point, but it was his job to make difficult decisions. He then said, in his smooth old country judge Southern accent, that it was obvious to him the dog in our photos was the same dog he was currently holding, and that he was, in these exact words, giving the dog back to the plaintiff, my mom. When Skank's lawyer heard this, she immediately popped up and stated, "We will be appealing this decision and request that the dog remain with Skank until after the appeal process." To this the judge replied again, in his wonderful slow Southern way, and his exact words are forever burned into my heart and brain. "Well, you can appeal if you want to, but I'm giving the dog back to the plaintiff." My mom and I broke down in relieved and grateful tears as Skank glared daggers at us. The judge then removed the t-shirt and collar from Mickey and handed them back to Skank, gave Mickey to the bailiff and said, "I want to see if the dog remembers the plaintiff." All eyes were on my mother as she made her way from the bench seats into the aisle, where she stood quietly about 35 feet away, while Skank stood much closer, about 5 feet from where the bailiff held Mickey. At this point, the bailiff leaned down, gently put Mickey on the floor, and as soon as his little feet hit the ground, without so much as even glancing at Skank, ran as fast his little legs could carry him straight to my mother, and literally jumped into her arms, immediately bathing her face in precious doggy kisses. I don't think I have ever seen my mother so happy, and even the judge and bailiff were grinning for all they were worth. I also saw quite a few people in the gallery wiping away happy tears. You would think this joyous show of affection at their reunion would prove to even Skank herself that this dog belonged with my mother. But alas, she did indeed appeal and even tried to say, with absolutely no evidence or truth whatsoever, that Mickey had been abused by us. Also, during the trial, Skank admitted to finding him the same day he went missing. And even though he had a collar with tags, and even though she admitted to seeing our lost dog ad in the paper, she had chosen to keep him because he was so adorable and she wanted a dog. After Skank said how attached she'd become to the dog and how much she missed him now that he was back with us, the judge told her it was her own fault she'd gotten attached, because she could have returned him the same day she found him. Anyway, after several months of litigation, 2 trials, a lot of hard work and $17,000 in lawyers' fees to get back our precious $400 dog, the Chancery Court judge also ruled in our favor, so Mickey was home to stay, and that horrible skank has been taught not to mess with someone who's willing to go to the mat and go broke for those she loves. My revenge was complete. Edit. I guess I felt my story was a revenge story because the groomer was forced to lose my mom's dog, which she did seem to be very attached to, due to her dishonesty and just plain nastiness. Had Skank been nice and returned Mickey to us, we would have happily allowed her to see him and maybe even have let him spend the night with her sometimes, also given her the reward for finding him. But since she was unreasonable, she wound up with nothing in the end. I also found out that after the last trial, Skank lost her job because she lied to the groomer about how she got Mickey. The owner of the business then realized Skank had ripped her off for thousands of dollars of grooming equipment. Last I heard, the Skank was actually in police custody for that theft. Story 6. My now fiancé, Jim, and I have always had a rocky relationship with his parents. I have no contact with my family due to past abuse, and I met Jim's parents during a very uncertain and frightening time in my life. They never particularly liked me and thought I was odd because of how nervous I was. However, I had good reason to feel that way. Jim still lived with them at the time, and I had heard a lot about how controlling they could be. His dad had a history of inappropriate behavior online and a tendency to lie about it, though I won't delve into the details. What I will say is that he never took accountability for his actions. Jim's mom, Becky, not only enabled him but also projected her fears onto Jim, becoming hyper-controlling during his teenage years. She assumed he would engage in the same behaviors just because he was male. For example, she didn't allow Jim to watch movies where women wore revealing outfits, even if they were animated characters. Films like Aladdin were banned because of Princess Jasmine's attire. It got to the point where even Happy Feet was off limits because she thought the penguins moved too suggestively. Jim also wasn't allowed to have social media accounts like Instagram or Facebook until he turned 18, as she feared he might see inappropriate images. However, these restrictions were not applied to his sister. Jim's first relationship, which began when he was 18, ended because his girlfriend couldn't tolerate Becky's behavior. Becky grounded him from seeing his girlfriend for a week because he posted a photo of them kissing. Jim complied because he wasn't financially able to move out at the time and was still coming to terms with how extreme the situation was. When the relationship ended, Becky refused to admit her role in the breakup. Instead, she ignored Jim while he struggled with severe depression for several months. Later, she even told him he had hurt the family by spending so much time in his room trying to cope with the breakup. I met Jim through my family's business. We became best friends, then fell in love. He helped me break free from an abusive situation and gain independence, though that's a story for another time, and we've been together ever since. When I first met his family, Becky wasn't as harsh on me as she had been on his ex-girlfriend, but it was still challenging. She would criticize nearly everything I did, always behind my back. I talked too much, or not enough. I didn't make enough eye contact or didn't look like I was listening. No matter what, there was always a problem. When Jim tried to stand up for me, Becky would overrule him, insisting she was right. If he explained that her behavior made me nervous, she'd get offended, claiming, "I'm not doing anything to make her nervous. She's just acting like I'm her mother." One of her biggest issues was with my clothing. She has very rigid ideas about what women should wear, especially women with curvier figures. In her home, I wasn't allowed to wear anything that showed skin below my collarbone because it might tempt her struggling husband. I am curvy, with a larger bust and wide hips, and it was clear she didn't approve of Jim choosing someone with my body type. If I wore leggings, my figure was a problem. But when I wore skirts, something I actually liked to do, they mocked me. I have a chronic pain condition that makes jeans uncomfortable, so I often felt like I couldn't win. Outside her home, I dressed the way I wanted, but she would see my photos on Facebook and complain. I considered unfriending her, but I didn't want to create unnecessary drama for Jim, who was already dealing with a lot constant criticism from his sister, unfair treatment from his dad, college stress, and working a second job to save for moving out. I thought it best to keep the peace until we had our own place. Over time, we noticed that Becky's rules were inconsistent. Jim's sister, Cindy, could wear outfits I wouldn't have been allowed to in Becky's house. Becky justified this by saying Cindy was more petite, making it clear the issue wasn't my clothing but my body. That realization made me incredibly uncomfortable. My body shape and size are things I cannot change. Fast forward a bit, Cindy began dating someone, and we expected him to face the same challenges I did. Instead, Becky adored Cindy's boyfriend. She gave him cute nicknames, welcomed him with open arms, and even seemed to fawn over him at family dinners. Jim and I speculated that Becky was either living vicariously through Cindy or just liked him more because she has always favored Cindy over Jim. Becky disapproved of every girl Jim had ever dated but adored Cindy's boyfriend, even though he practiced a different religion, a point Becky had always been rigid about. Jim felt hurt by the double standards. We weren't allowed to do anything beyond holding hands in front of his family. If we hugged or put our arms around each other, Becky would scold us and tell Jim to act like friends. Meanwhile, Cindy could openly flirt with her boyfriend in the kitchen, and Becky thought it was cute. This, along with other frustrations, pushed us to put a deposit down on an apartment. When Jim told his parents he was moving in with me, unmarried, they reacted strongly, but Becky calmed down when she realized he was serious. After moving out, things improved briefly. We saw them once a month or on holidays instead of every Sunday, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to see us for about 2 months. Then, Cindy started acting entitled again. Jim's dad reverted to being authoritarian, and Becky resumed her nitpicking. The turning point came during a theater production of Macbeth, where Jim co-directed, and I played Lady Macbeth. It was a significant event for Jim, but also stressful. Last minute, we had to arrange costumes ourselves. For the banquet scene, I wore a red formal gown that was off the shoulder with some cleavage. I asked Jim if he was okay with it, given his mom would be in the audience. He shrugged it off, saying, "They'll complain, but I don't have to plan my show around their opinions." During the performance, Becky and Jim's dad walked out at intermission. The cast was shocked, as the gown wasn't overly revealing, and I only wore it for 15 minutes on stage, standing 30 feet away. Jim was hurt that his parents would walk out of something so important to him. When Becky called a few days later, she accused Jim of being a bad partner for letting me wear that dress and claimed he did it to spite her. Jim called out her hypocrisy, pointing out how she enjoys movies like Titanic and Pearl Harbor, which have more provocative content, and attends family events where women wear far more revealing outfits. The conversation ended without resolution. A few days later, I shared an article on social media about how society unfairly places the blame on women for men's inappropriate behavior. Becky publicly criticized the post, arguing that no one cares about the wife of a man who struggles with such issues. I replied politely but firmly, pointing out that resources like therapy and support groups are available for women in that position, while society unfairly blames women who are objectified regardless of how they dress. Becky continued her public tirade, and I eventually responded more assertively, expressing my frustration with her constant criticism. This led to an argument over text. Without giving me time to reply, Becky texted Jim, saying she was cutting contact with us until we had a change of heart. Jim was furious. He sent his parents a detailed message outlining the years of mistreatment and gaslighting, suggesting that some distance might be beneficial. We had a peaceful, stress-free Thanksgiving, and Jim proposed to me shortly afterward. His family didn't acknowledge the engagement, which was unsurprising, as they had ignored every milestone in our relationship. Becky eventually reached out, claiming a package had been delivered to their house and inviting Jim over. Her cheerful tone, after everything that had happened, infuriated him further. He responded bluntly, referencing her decision to cut contact. When she tried to backtrack, he chose to ignore her. Our wedding is planned for October, and invitations will go out in March. Jim and I agree that his parents won't be invited unless they show genuine accountability and make an effort to mend the relationship. We're doubtful they will, but only time will tell.